We begin with the complex and too often misunderstood condition of epilepsy. 1 in 25 Australians will suffer it. Many will be reluctant to talk about it because of embarrassment and discrimination. So, hats off to our colleague, TV star and broadcaster Ben Fordham, who was diagnosed at age 7 and is about to share his story with you. Ben drew comfort when footy legend Wally Lewis went public about his epilepsy, and he wanted to help others the same way. So did we.
It was the fear of the unknown more than anything, and it scared the living daylights out of me. I don't think I've ever been as scared in my life, and I've been in a few tricky situations, including at times working for a current affair, where you put yourself in situations where you're not in complete safety. But I've never been so scared in my life because I didn't know what was going on.
Ben Fordham was just 7 years old the first time it happened.
I think it was like a racing inside of my head, where I felt like my brain was out of control. And this is now looking back. As a 7-year-old, I had no clue what was going on. I just knew I was really scared and I didn't know what was happening to me.
Okay, so it's scary for you at the age of 7. It would have been pretty scary for your parents too, I imagine.
Really scary for Mum and Dad. They ended up taking me up to a medical centre, and I remember sitting in there and I remember seeing my dad. I think it was the first time I'd seen a tear in my dad's eye. I remember thinking, and I knew then, well, this is quite serious because Dad looks like he's starting to cry.
His parents had just seen their son have his very first seizure.
When I was a kid, I used to describe it to Mum and Dad as being at the top of the escalator. This sounds a bit bizarre, but if you imagine being at the top of the escalator and the steps coming up, and I used to describe it as becoming faster and faster and faster, and I felt like a feeling of impending doom about what was about to come up those escalators.
It's a bit like waking up in the middle of the night from a doorbell and you wake up. Is that the phone? Is it an alarm? Is it you have to orientate yourself before you're okay again? Yeah.
How often do you have them?
Every 3 or 4 days, but it could be up to a week, so there's no set answer.
Nina Tavru had her first focal seizure at just 3 years of age. She loses control of her body and has no memory afterwards.
It was hard to cope with, especially at school. I had a lot of teasing, and I believe that's because you do unusual things that kids just don't understand. So the teasing comes in, and I spent a lot of my primary school days with breaks in the girls' toilets, only because I didn't want the taunting and the teasing.
How much notice do you get when you're going to have one?
About 30 seconds.
And what do you do in that time?
You need to work out whether it's safe around you, whether you're going to break something, whether, I don't know, somebody will freak out. There's lots of things to consider. And it's really embarrassing. Like sometimes when you fall, you let go of everything, including your bladder. Mm. And if you're at a workplace, it's not considered very nice. So you sort of learn how to do things to adapt, maybe go to the toilet more frequently or something along those lines. Yeah.
Ben and Nina have epilepsy, sort of a short circuit in the brain that often, but not always, responds to a trigger. 1 in 25 Australians will have epilepsy at some point in their life. 70% of these cases are controlled with medical intervention, meaning a third will never have freedom from seizures.
Their world's really uncertain. They're often unable to work, they're unable to drive their car, they get socially isolated. And unfortunately, for around 300 people per annum in Australia, they actually die as a result of their seizures.
It's a very complex condition. There are 44 epilepsy syndromes that fall into 2 main types, generalised and focal.
The first type is a convulsive seizure, where someone might stiffen, fall to the ground and jerk around. The other types are a focal seizure, where only one part of the brain's affected. And those symptoms may have people wandering around, distracted. It might have them sort of doing funny movements. It might have them looking a bit like they're under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Have a seat.
Graham Shears is from the Epilepsy Foundation of Australia.
There's a range of underlying reasons why people might have seizures and get a diagnosis of epilepsy. So There could be a brain insult, and that could be anything from a hit on the head to some sort of genetic problem at childbirth to a cancerous tumour or an infection in the brain.
Do you know what your triggers are?
No. I used to think that it was sunshine for some reason. I think I've had random triggers. So I could be eating lunch, I could be on the phone. Maybe it's when I've been alone that it tends to come on. If I'm focused and having a conversation, now that I think about it, I don't think I can ever remember one when I've been engaging with someone.
Right.
But it's in your own moment, or if I'm focusing on something or racing to do things, that I feel like it starts to fire up on me a little bit.
Can you imagine how your life would be if your epilepsy was not as well controlled as it clearly is?
Well, I couldn't do what I do for a living. I do a live radio show for a living, and I've done live television for a living, and so I wouldn't be able to do that, which is a real worry. G'day there and welcome to Sydney Live. I grew up as a 15-year-old hanging around radio stations and doing work experience, and very early on discovered this is what I want to do. I want to be on the radio and I want to host my own radio show, and I love TV as well. Well, I wouldn't be able to do those things because I don't think you could sit in a studio environment like that, live on air, interviewing politicians or doing whatever you're doing, if I had a bad case of epilepsy and I was having serious seizures. If you had a few of those incidents happen to you on air, then I guess the boss would probably at some stage think, well, is this really the guy we want for the job?
You want to be normal. You want to be with everybody and not have that distraction. And I think you have to make allowances, and that's when people aren't so tolerant.
Does having epilepsy mean that in a sense you never quite feel like you're in control?
I think that's very true. Even to the extent, like, I'm not driving, but I have some sisters that live about a 20-minute drive away. To get there by public transport, it would take just over 3 hours. So what happens is we don't have that strong connection because we're not visiting on a regular basis. They've got family, so they can't sort of always make it down this way. If you have a group of friends and you want to organise, say, I don't know, weekend away, they'll tend to go, oh, you can organise the catering, you can organise oh, you're not driving. And so there's that. I think they mean it with the best intentions, but it is almost like, we'll just leave you out because it's too inconvenient for you. So.
You've tried surgery, haven't you?
Twice. For about a month I had nothing and I was so excited. And then we were going out and I had a shower and I was actually in the bathroom with my sister and I had one and I didn't get a warning at all, which is so unusual. And that was the start of them starting up again. They've taken quite a bit of brain out, but it's good. The only side effects for me personally are peripheral vision is gone and face identification. So if I saw you in the street, I probably wouldn't recognise you. Sorry.
There's two basic forms of surgery. There's surgery which involves removal of part of brain, and there's surgery which involves the implantation of electrodes to stimulate part of the brain. So we can use all of these methods to try and pin down where in the brain the seizures are coming from, and if it's a part that we can get at safely, then we can remove that with surgery often. So that's obviously a very big deal to do.
Professor Mark Cook is an epileptologist and head of neurology at the University of Melbourne. He says while surgery is always a risk for epilepsy sufferers, it's often one worth taking.
The success rates are pretty good. Now, it depends a lot on the person and what the cause of the seizures is and where in the brain it is, but in the most common forms of epilepsy, we can get success rates of 70-80% cure. Most people with epilepsy aren't suitable candidates, unfortunately, because the abnormalities causing their seizures simply aren't things that can be removed, or they're too big to remove, or they're just in parts of the brain that are too dangerous to get at.
Her arms and legs would jerk and tense up. They were very short, like a split second. If you weren't looking, you wouldn't see them. And she would have lots of them every day.
7-year-old Violet Unthank has spent most of her life in and out of hospitals. At 8 weeks, her parents, David and Belinda, noticed unusual behaviour, and 5 months later, she was diagnosed with epilepsy.
Her seizures were very long, half an hour, was the average length. The first one, she was intensive care, she was tubes, to breathe. When she had a seizure, everything stopped, and you just had to deal with the seizure. The thought was that she would grow out of her epilepsy. Around 2 to 2.5, we were told that it wasn't looking like she would, and that was, I think I cried for a week.
The diagnosis was, it was a shock to the system. There's your little girl, your little baby as such, and you just realise that she's got a disorder that's going to affect her, and there was nothing I could do about it. It's a balancing act. It's hard, and it's hard now that Violet's getting older. She now wants to, we like going to the Victorian High Country four-wheel driving, but that's too far away from medical help for Violet.
It's now been almost a year since Violet had her last seizure, and she now goes to school 4 half days a week. It means after years of trying different medications, they've finally found the right one to control Violet's seizures.
Although we've got all of these drugs, there are still quite a lot of people who aren't controlled with them, and this causes a lot of misunderstandings, particularly with government, who wonder why we need so many drugs. We've already got a lot of drugs for epilepsy, why do we need more? And the answer is that none of them work perfectly for everyone. Everyone's very individual, and often you find that one person might respond very well to one drug that no one else does.
And brings the house down.
It was just 6 weeks ago that news of Buddy Franklin's epilepsy made headlines.
I thought, oh no, here it comes.
He joined only a few high-profile people to publicly admit they suffer from the illness.
I mean, I'm 38, and the only people with public profile who I've heard in my life with epilepsy are Wally Lewis and Buddy Franklin. That's not very many.
Probably because a lot of people keep it a secret.
Well, they do. I have no idea about that. I mean, well, I should, because I kind of did, now that I think about it. Not that I did within my family, but I've since discovered a lot of people, including politicians, who are household names, who have epilepsy. And they've contacted me and said, oh mate, I've got it as well. And I said, well, you should come on my radio show and talk about it. And they said, oh no, I've never really talked about it. Isn't that great?
As the new ambassador for Epilepsy Australia, Ben Fordham's goal is to make sure that stigma goes for good.
When did you find out you had epilepsy?
When I was 6.
How old are you now?
12.
Did you have any idea what epilepsy was when they told you you had epilepsy?
No.
It's not the end of the world, I can tell you that. It's not the end of the world, because there's a lot of people out there who've got epilepsy.
You look like the guy from Family Feud.
Yes, Grant Denyer. Oh my God, I'm taller than that. I'm not that short, look.
You look like his brother.
Oh
dear.
Will that make the cut?
We live in a modern society where people understand diseases like HIV and multiple sclerosis and diabetes, but when people tell their friends that they've got epilepsy, they'll often lose friends. They'll often lose their job. They'll often find that their kids aren't allowed to play with the kids next door anymore, because we've got this very old-fashioned idea, very primitive idea about what epilepsy is.
Ready, here we go. I think it's great that you're doing this story, to be able to let people know what it is. It's nothing to be afraid of. It can be managed in many cases, and to give people around the epilepsy sufferer the peace of mind to know, hey, you don't have anything to worry about by falling in love with this person, employing this person, or hanging out with this person. You don't have anything to worry about, and you've given a gift to those people by providing the community and society in general with a little bit more knowledge about it.
And if you need support for epilepsy, there is help available. Contact Epilepsy Australia's National Information Line on 1300 852 853. That's 1300 852 853. And because seizures can obviously happen in public places, it's so important for all of us to know how to recognise one and how you can support the sufferer through the episode and the confusion afterwards. There are links on our website.